Now calling Minister of Education to move amendment number 2. I understand the Minister sharing with Deputies Humphreys and Phelan.
That's correct, Last Councillor, and I do wish to formally move the alternative motion in this debate. I want to thank Sinn Féin and Jonathan O'Brien in particular for putting this topic on for discussion. It's a very comprehensive motion. I'm not sure that we'll be able to give it the attention that it does, but we'll have other days and other times to do so. I'd like to remind the House that when this government came into office 2.5 years ago, Ireland was in a very precarious position as a result of economic mismanagement on a vast scale. Since then, it has been the difficult and sometimes unpopular task of government to get this country moving again and moving towards economic recovery and into a position where we can once again control our economic destiny. The latest financial figures show that we are on track to meet our targets under the EU-IMF programme of financial support and to achieve a successful exit from that programme. And we will be the first European country to so do, when we do it. The task of regaining our economic independence, however, has not been easy, given the massive differential between what was being spent by the government and what was being collected by way of taxes back before we came into government. Narrowing this gap is essential in order for equilibrium to be restored. While the gap has been reduced significantly, we are still, in 2013, obliged to borrow €1 million a month to fund our services. This simply is not a sustainable situation. However, while there is work still to be done, the Government is confident that our policies can help in turning the economy around to a strengthened position of both stability and growth. I make these opening comments to inject an element of realism into the debate that has just proceeded. Significant investment in education expenditure in Ireland is reflected in the most recent OECD statistics from its Education at a Glance series of reports. The latest set of results, published in June of this year, shows that expenditure on education in Ireland in 2010 was 6.4% of GDP. This compared favourably to an OECD average of 6.3. 6.3 the average, and we're at 6.4, marginally ahead of the average. The report also showed that expenditure on higher education at 1.6% of GDP was the same of the OECD average. Between 2005 and 2010 in Ireland, total public and private spending on education below higher level increased by 44% in real terms. This compared to an average increase of 13% across the OECD. In higher education, expenditure in Ireland grew in real terms by 40%, compared to an average 20% average rise across the OECD. These latest OECD results therefore paint a different picture of Irish education expenditures than earlier OECD results would indicate. It is unfortunate that Sinn Féin chose to ignore the latest available figures in compiling their private members' motion and have instead relied on data published more than 3 years ago. A debate on the appropriate level of state expenditure on education is welcome, and I do welcome it, but we must ensure that such debate is up-to-date and properly informed. Great importance during the course of the debate has been attached to improving retention rates of pupils at second level as a key factor in improving overall levels of educational attainment. And I share the concerns that have been expressed by Sinn Féin deputies across the way. Over 90% of all students in Irish schools now sit the Leaving Certificate. Over 90%. The highest ever rate proof of the success of policies which strive to keep young people in school. These figures put the percentage of early school leavers in Ireland considerably lower than the EU average of 14% school leavers, where 10% are slightly less, as against the average of 14%. There is never room to be complacent in this area, and I'm certainly not complacent. 10% of early school leavers remains, for me, far too many young people leaving school prematurely and heading into a very uncertain future. But our performance relative to other EU countries shows that we are having some success in this area. Retention rates in disadvantaged schools have improved even more markedly, due in large part to the supports offered through the DEIS Action Plan for Educational Inclusion. and I will be happy on another occasion to discuss that in some detail as to why it is actually working. Retention rates for second-level schools have increased by almost 12% over a 5-year period between pupils who entered second level in 2001 and those who entered in 2006. There is clear evidence that the DESH programme is having a positive effect in tackling educational disadvantage and is an example of funding well spent. 850 DESH schools across the primary and post-primary sectors receive additional funding of the order of 70 million to provide a range of supports for pupils in these schools, including lower pupil-teacher ratios in the most disadvantaged schools. In addition to measures to promote educational inclusion in schools, the Government is also committed to facilitating access to higher education. A key objective of the current National Strategy for Higher Education is to promote access to higher education for disadvantaged groups. The Higher Education Systems Performance Framework was published by the Department earlier this year. It sets out how progress towards national objectives, such as increasing access of certain disadvantaged groups, including students from lower socioeconomic group backgrounds, can in fact be made. The overall evaluation of the progress on the plan will be completed later this year. A new national access plan is being developed for the period 2014-2016. The Department supports a range of measures which facilitate greater levels of participation by disadvantaged students, mature students, and also students with disabilities. The principal support in financial terms is provided for under the Student Grant Scheme. Deputies, approximately 42% of all students in full-time higher education in the outgoing academic year were in receipt of a student grant. Just under half. Just under a half. Let me turn now to literacy and numeracy, something that has animated me for quite some time and long before I came into this position as Minister for Education. This Government is strongly committed to improving literacy and numeracy levels in schools. I described the PISA, that's the Programme for International Student Assessment results, on maths and reading published in late 2010. I think that should be 2009. I'm not sure. I think it should be 2009. As a wake-up call for the Irish education system. The programme for government, brought in by this new coalition, made literacy and numeracy a national priority. The 2011 to 2020 National Strategy to Improve Literacy and Numeracy among Children and Young People was published in July of 2011. The Government since then has ring-fenced some 12 million for the rollout of the strategy, while a further 9 million has been invested across other related activities. The strategy contains 41 actions and 180 sub-actions across 6 key areas. Primary schools were asked to increase the time each week spent on mathematics and literacy in class, and to introduce a third point in standardised testing in English reading and mathematics. This will mean that pupils are tested at the end of 2nd, 4th and 6th class. And if you don't measure, you won't know. Specific targets have been set to measure progress against the strategy. In addition, ongoing implementation of significant junior cycle reform aims to develop an integrated approach to promote the development of literacy and numeracy skills right across the curriculum. The results of PISA 2012 study are due to be published in December of this year, and I hope that we will see some improvement in those figures after that change in approach. I have to say also that the programme for government also seeks to promote adult literacy through the integration of literacy and vocational training and through community education. And I want to tell the House that I made it a point of the legislation, and Deputy O'Brien will be aware of this, that Solas, unlike FOSS, will have for the first time a specific statutory responsibility to be aware of literacy problems amongst people who come into long-term training programmes. The last time we measured literacy amongst the adult population in this country, it demonstrated that 500,000 of our fellow citizens had literacy problems. And if they have literacy problems, they have employment problems. Let's turn now to teachers' class size and staffing schedules. Salary costs of teaching staff in schools constitute the most significant element of the education budget, amounting to some 3.8 billion in 2013, or some 47% of the overall voted current expenditure. While difficult choices had to be made to identify savings across the department, the government has sought to protect frontline services as best as possible. The focus is on ensuring that there are sufficient school places and teachers for the thousands of additional pupils entering our schools each year. However, I think I'm nearly running out of time if I'm at 20.
10 minutes.
I have 10 minutes, but I have far more here. Can I propose that I put it into the record of the House and that the other two speakers share the 10 minutes between them? Is that in order?
Sorry, you have 10 minutes remaining.
10 minutes remaining?
Yeah.
Oh, I beg your pardon, sorry. There is no realistic scope at present to give any consideration. I'm sorry, I thought that was the full 30 minutes. Thank you very much indeed. There is no realistic scope at present to give any consideration to the provision of additional teachers in order to reduce class sizes. However, increases in the school population as a result of demographics will give rise under existing policy to demand for an additional 800 to 1,000 teachers on average each year over the medium term. And by medium term, I'm talking about the next 6 to 10 years. Classroom teachers in primary schools are currently allocated under the published staffing schedule on the basis of a general average of 1 teacher for every 28 pupils, with lower thresholds for DESH Band 1 and primary schools. This 28:1 ratio has been protected by this government over the last 3 years, or 2.5 years. The staffing schedule sets out in a fair and transparent manner the pupil thresholds for the allocation of mainstream classroom posts for all schools and treats all similar types of schools equally, irrespective of location. Irrespective of location, and I hope that Deputy Doherty picks that up. At post-primary level, the standard staffing allocation for schools is based on a ratio of 19:1. DESH post-primary schools operate on a standard staffing allocation of 18.25:1. The main budget measure to affect staffing of post-primary schools in the current school year was confined to fee-charging schools, of which there are 55 out of the 729 in the country. The standard staffing allocation for fee-charging schools was increased to 23:1 with effect from September of this year. This reflects the fact that fee-charging schools have the resources, through fees charged, to employ teachers privately, an option which is not available to schools in the free education scheme. Budget for education, including the number of teaching posts that we can afford to fund in schools, is a matter that we'll have to consider with my colleagues in the Cabinet over the next week or so before the forthcoming budget. The Government will endeavour to protect frontline education services as best as possible, as we have done in the past. Let me turn now to special needs resource teachers and SNAs. This Government has passionately defended the provision for special education spending since coming into office. Some 1.3 billion will be spent in support of children with special education needs this year. That's exactly the same amount of money, by coincidence, that we give to the entire operation of the Garda Síochána, 1.3 billion. This provision is in line with expenditure in recent years and shows that despite the current economic difficulties, funding for special education as a total sum of money has not been cut. Same amount this year as was last year and the year before. The level of expenditure which has been provided means that the majority of pupils with special education needs can continue to be educated in an inclusive environment in mainstream schools along with their peers. It also means that for pupils who have additional special education needs which require intensive interventions in a specialised environment, special class and special school placements can continue to be provided for. Over 1,100 teaching posts in special schools will continue to be provided for this school year, The National Council for Special Education, the NCSE, has also opened 118 new special classes for the forthcoming academic year, 2013-2014, which now brings the total number of special classes to 740 currently provided. This year we will again provide funding for 10,575 whole-time equivalent SNAs. There has been no reduction to the overall number of SNA posts which are available for allocation to schools. No reduction. The number remains at 10,575 posts available for allocation. It should also be noted that unlike many other areas of the public sector, SNA vacancies are being filled up to this number. In relation to the allocation of resource teaching support for schools, in June of this year I authorised the NCSE to maintain the level of resource teaching allocations to be provided to individual students at existing levels. There has been growing demand for resources in this area, and I have agreed to provide the necessary extra posts to reflect this increase in demand. There will therefore not be a reduction in resource teaching time for these pupils over the amount of support provided last year. And that is a change in policy in response to a genuine sense of concern. Deputies, however, will also be aware that the NCSE recently published comprehensive policy advice on supporting students with special education needs in schools. I have requested the NCSE, on foot of that change in policy, to establish a working group to develop a proposal for consideration for a new allocation model for teaching supports for children with special education needs. I'm not satisfied, deputies, and I'd be happy to discuss this wherever we wish, that the present model, which is at least 18 years old, is working satisfactorily. And we all know much more, and resources, no matter who's in government, are going to be finite. But let's work at getting a system that we can all share is a better one. I expect to have an update on the work of this group, which is led by Eamon Stack, the former Chief Inspector of the Department and currently the Chair of the NCSE, and when we get that report we can discuss it. Deputies, and in particular former Education spokesman for Sinn Féin, Sean Crowe, talked about back-to-school costs. Tackling the costs associated with school is a major priority of mine and has been for some time, and is obviously a very topical issue at the present time. Since becoming Minister for Education and Skills, I've taken a number of steps aimed at helping reduce the burden on families. In relation to the cost of school textbooks, I met with members of the Irish Educational Publishers Association and received a commitment from them in writing to limit the publication of new editions of textbooks and to maintain editions of books in print unchanged for at least 6 years. Some books were changing arbitrarily every 2 or 3 years and the substance hadn't changed. You know, the map of Ireland hasn't changed. Publishers have also assured me that they would sell books for rental schemes to schools at a substantial discount, something to the wholesale rate that they were given to booksellers, but not entirely the same. Deputies will also be aware that I am much in favour of schools establishing textbook rental schemes. I launched new guidelines for developing textbook rental schemes in schools in January of this year. These guidelines provide practical advice to primary and post-primary schools on how rental schemes can be established and operated. The aim of the guidelines is to help as many schools as possible to start such book rental programmes as soon as they can. I hope that schools that are not yet operating book rental schemes will be encouraged to use the guidelines to introduce them, to provide substantial savings for parents. Schools which already have rental schemes can save parents up to 80% of the cost of buying new books. I will continue to monitor the number of schools operating book rental schemes, and if it proves necessary, I will consider further steps to encourage schools to so do. I've also made clear my support for measures to reduce uniform costs to parents, including measures such as the use of generic type uniforms, and we've had discussions about this, or the use of sewn-on crests. There's about 4 or 5 generic colours, if you like, for school uniforms, and we're all familiar with them. And the ones that you can get in the various big retail outlets are a fraction of what bespoke individual school uniforms are. And the technology and the practices available for the sewn-on crest to deal with the particularisation of the branding of an individual school. I want to tell deputies in this House that I've raised this matter with the National Parents Council at primary level and recommended that the National Parents Council, both primary and post-primary, mobilise parents' associations to raise this issue directly with the schools' authorities. You know, the only group that's recognised in our Constitution in terms of education is the family, and the primary role of the family as the initial primary educator of children. The schools' authorities and the department are not recognised in the same way, and yet the weakest component, in my view, are in fact families.
Tell the Minister there's 1 minute remaining.
So I think we should have to move there. And I believe that schools should consult parents in these matters relating to their children's education, including those matters which have cost implications. In that regard, I believe that students and parents, I should say, will be enhanced by a parent and student charter that I'm proposing to draft up in consultation with interested parties and to give it some statutory basis so that in fact parents will be empowered to actually do some of the things that I think deputies in this House share across the political spectrum. There are other things, Elas Cahirlach, that I think can in fact be referred to, but in deference to time, I have 10 minutes to go.
No, just
Sorry.
seconds.
10 seconds. 10 seconds. Well then, no, there's some things about changes that we're making elsewhere, but I don't want to deprive my colleagues of speaking time. But I want to thank Sinn Féin for introducing this motion. Thank you.
Come here, Margaret.